Here we are inside of an ASP.NET MVC4 application that's still using the MVC3 approach to build an asynchronous controller. So it derived from an asynchronous controller base class, and what I want to do is change this around to use the async await features that are in MVC4 and Visual Studio 2012 and see what an improvement it is. But before we do that, let's review what this home controller index method is essentially doing. It's calling two different web services, one to get the news, one to get the current weather, and both of those services are slow. They take around 2 seconds to complete a call to either one of those. So we're doing it asynchronously with help from the async manager, and I have some messages sprinkled throughout here so we can see which thread is executing which part of the code. And of course, by the time we get to index completed, we'll have built an entire model with the current news and the current weather and all our messages, and we'll be able to render a view. What it currently looks like is this. So there we can see the current news headline, current temperature. The total time to render was just over 2 seconds because those web service calls take 2 seconds to complete each, but we called them in parallel. So the elapsed time to render was just over 2,000 milliseconds. And we can see at least 4 different threads were involved. Thread 7 started the action. Thread 11 called into index complete. We had threads 14 and 13 finishing up work from our web service calls. And what I'd like to do, even before we get to async await, is now clean this up to get rid of all the MVC3 async stuff, because it's actually going to be easier to go back to what it would look like when it was not asynchronous, and then add the async await keywords. That's how much they clean things up. So we'll instantiate the model, the news client, and the weather client. And I'd still like to add a message that says when we're starting the action. But then I'd just like to make synchronous calls for right now. And say model.headline equals news client dot get headline. Just make a synchronous call. Model.temperature equals weather client dot get current temperature. That's a synchronous call. That will put our model together. That's everything that we need for our model. And now what I could do is just take this code, say that we're finishing up the action, we're going to return the view. We no longer need the index completed. And now this index method needs to return an action result or a view result. Now I'll do a quick build and we'll run this to see how it behaves. It shouldn't be very surprising if we see that everything occurs on a single thread and that it now takes over 4 seconds to complete. So there we go, a little over 7 seconds. Maybe that's because I'm on a virtual machine and there's a lot of disk churning here when I recompile everything. So I'll refresh it for just a second. But you can see that the action started on the same thread that it finished on. There we are with an elapsed time of just over 4 seconds. And we still get the same temperature and news headline, the ones that we expected. The important part to point out about this right now is that when a request thread comes in to start processing the index action, it is going to block and wait until we retrieve a headline. It is going to block and wait until we retrieve the current temperature. And that particular thread is not going to be able to do anything else while it's waiting for those web service calls to return. That's the first problem that we're going to solve with async and await.